Mad Max Fury Road might be one big car chase, but there's method to the madness. In Australia, for the Graphic Festival at Sydney's Opera House, director George Miller spoke to CNET about how a graphic novel approach brought depth to the destruction. George Miller, thank you for speaking with CNET.
Thank you.
It seems with this film you kind of threw out the idea of scripting in the early stages and instead chose to do 3,500 storyboards to create the idea of the film, kind of in a graphic novel style. Does this mean at heart you're just a really big comic book nerd?
I was always a comic book kid. I mean, when I grew up in the country in Queensland, they were required illicit comics. You couldn't take them to school. Your parents thought something was wrong with you if you're reading comics rather than reading books. And so I always loved comics. And this movie itself, the original idea was for it to be an extended chase, and in many ways a silent movie with sound. We were trying to tell as much story as possible purely with vision. So the obvious way to approach it was to do storyboards. And I worked with 3 storyboard artists, and the key one and designer was Brendan McCarthy, and who was a graphic novelist and a very, very fine artist. And we worked, ultimately Nico Lathouris, who's a dramaturg and actor, came along, and we dug down deep into the subtext. But essentially, its first iteration was an extended storyboard, which is the perfect way to get information across on an action movie, because people can see exactly what's happening at any moment. And it's just a blueprint. It's not the final thing.
Okay, so if you're penning a comic like Spider-Man, you might not have any limitations. Were there any limitations when you're creating these from that kind of graphic novel style base, when you have to put it onto film? Was there anything you couldn't do?
Well, we couldn't defy the laws of physics. This is not a superhero movie, no flying men, no spaceships or anything like that. So it basically told us how to make the movie. We went old school. There were real vehicles and real people and real crashes in a real desert. And the essential image, the first image that we captured was always real. There was no CG there, but everything else was augmented by CG. And then we were able to use the technology that we normally couldn't in the past and erase it in CG. So we had elaborate rigs on actors and stunt people, so when the vehicles were hurtling through the desert, people could be kept safe. That was Tom Hardy upside down between the big wheels of a big war rig.
You've kind of mechanized the human characters in it, and the machines have a life of their own. How do you create a human story under such a thriller, high-octane, explosive? It could have just been a bullets and guns and explosions film, but it's clearly not. What involved in the story helped to build that up?
Well, you try to create as much iceberg under the tip. Take Coma, for instance. Even though he appears only briefly throughout the movie, I know who his mother was, I know how he survived the apocalypse, I know how a man who's blind and mute and really can only play the guitar, how he actually survived and got to be where he was. He's the equivalent of the drummer, the bugler, the bagpipe player, the music of war, but it had to be upgraded to account for all the noise that happens with all the vehicles. So that happened with everything, and not only with, like Max's mask, which is a garden hoe, or taking that guitar, it's a hospital bedpan at the base of it. Every vehicle, every steering wheel was kind of, in a sense, almost a religious artifact. And we had to understand it's basically found objects repurposed. The one thing I will say about a movie like this, it's basically visual music. So the vision has primacy. You try to tell the story almost like a silent movie with sound, and that's why we set about it. And that's a point of difference in the movie. The trick was to see whether or not all that subtext could be read by the audience in something that moves so fast.
From storyboard to cinema on the Fury Road, George Miller will appear at the Sydney Opera House on October 11.
It was hard to know who was more crazy, me or everyone else.